Hi, this is Richard and Craig with the Week 2 feedback video. This week we're going to look at mindful stress reduction and how to train our attention cultivating qualities like curiosity and gentleness. As you can see, neither Craig or myself are in any kind of studio today. We're in an office and my home office. So I guess that's just the world that we're living in at the moment. So it's a very opportune time, very important time, I guess, to be practicing and learning mindfulness. And I guess online courses are probably a very good way of learning and doing things right
now. These are interesting times indeed, and I think a great time to be learning and practicing mindfulness, because I think or perhaps even more contagious than coronavirus is the potential for fear and anxiety. So we've got a situation to deal with, but I think mindfulness might help us to deal with the situation as well as we can on a personal level.
Yes, and also on a collective level as well. And I think it was very good timing this week of the course, because we talked about stress and how there are things that are happening around us that of course contribute to the level of stress that we experience, but how what's happening in the mind has so much to do with it. And a lot of our learners, a lot of you noticed certain things that you were caught up in thinking about that were contributing to that stress response. Of course, we're faced with so much uncertainty at the moment, so much unknown, whether it's health related or economic or social. And of course, the mind just fills that vacuum with catastrophic thinking and worry. And of course, we're being bombarded with media messages that stir that up. And all of that triggers the fight and flight and freeze response in the body, the stress response in the body, which of course makes us stressed, can lead to things like anxiety. And so a lot of you were starting to notice that and to explore how mindfulness can help us to step out of that just by noticing that fight and flight response has been triggered. And then to bring the attention back to what's actually happening, focusing on what is rather than getting caught up in what if.
Yes, that's right. And the mind, so easily can project into a future that hasn't happened. We so easily the mind can imagine things that we take to be real when we're lost in those thoughts. So really helping to be mindful, to ground ourselves back in this moment now can be tremendously helpful. And learning to just ride those waves of, fear or anxiety that might arise, but without getting swept away by them. We'll be touching on this in a little bit more detail next week, of course, but I think already the relevance of these skills are becoming pretty apparent. Another interesting and important aspect too relates to how psychological and emotional stress can affect our immunity as well. There's a whole field of science called Psychoneuroimmunology. And we know that when we're very stressed over a significant period of time, we're more likely to get sick if we're exposed to a virus. And if we get one, we're more likely to experience more severe symptoms and for it to go longer. And I think this is a really good time to be looking after our mental health, because we know that things like mindfulness and anything we do to enhance our mental health also has a really nice side effect of enhancing our immune response, our resistance to conditions as well. So there's quite a lot of science around that these days. And so I think it's really good to remind ourselves of that. And mindfulness is one of the techniques that can certainly help in that regard as well.
Definitely. And of course, that's true in the moment, because when we start getting caught up in stressful or anxious thinking, that's impairing our immunity. But then what effect does that start to have on things like sleep? Of course, a lot of people at home now working from home. And if we're anxious working from home, what kinds of foods are we eating? As we're social distancing, of course, there's a disconnection. So what are we filling that time with? Are we staying in touch with people, or are we just watching a bunch of Netflix? And so all of those things together are really important. Keeping all of that in mind is going to maximize our immunity right now. And of course, minimize the chance that we contract any viruses and of course, lead to better outcomes ultimately. Yeah. What about some of our learners, Craig, asked some really interesting questions about mental health and whether that differs around the globe, and also whether it differs between genders.
Yes, well, it seems that levels of anxiety and depression generally have been going up for a number of decades, particularly in the developed world. It seems to be a particularly developed world kind of thing. and the pace of life, expectations. Living in a more material age is associated with it as well, where we get so preoccupied about material things, which, as we know, often can be very fragile and so on. But it seems to be a particularly developed world, particularly Western world kind of thing at the moment. There is some interesting work too around gender and the stress response, because most of the early research was done on males, and so fight or flight was the predominant paradigm. And then more research started to look at women in the stress, experiencing the stress response. And male hormones like testosterone accentuate fight or flight, but female hormones, particularly oxytocin, but estrogens as well, they produce what's called a tend and befriend response. Very interesting paper that sort of put it on the horizon in about the year 2000 by a lady by the name of Taylor, and hundreds of references to look at how these female hormones produce tend and befriend. So, and it's not that women don't have fight or flight, and it's not that men don't have tend and befriend, but it's like, in very broad terms, each is more specialized in the one than the other. And I think those two responses put together are a lot more adaptive than just having fight or flight or just having tend and befriend. We kind of need both of them, really.
Yes. Yeah. And of course, their survival response is designed to help us survive, ultimately, I guess, physical threats, and social threats as well. And mindfulness, of course, offers a different way of responding to them. And that's what a lot of our learners, of course, have been noticing and practicing this week.
Yes.
You've been noticing that whether it's through meditation and just learning to keep the attention in the present, even just that basic exercise of focusing on three things. If we start to get a bit stressed and anxious, we can notice, what are three things I can see right now, and name them to ourselves. What are three things I can hear? What are three things I can feel, making contact with my body? Because anything that gets us back in the senses gets us back in the present moment, rather than being caught up in projections into the future or dwelling on the past.
Yes, yeah. This fight or flight response is really necessary, adaptive and useful when we are eyeball to eyeball with a 4-meter shark or with a saber-toothed tiger or something like that. It's not helpful to be activating it over imaginary tigers and imaginary sharks. And that's where most of the stress is, and that's where it really has a negative impact on our health. And so, and this is something I hope that our learners are really going to be interested to get more into, to use those grounding exercises to come back. And if there is a shark there, then fight or fly, but otherwise, just chill.
Yeah. And how we train our attention is so important as well. And this was another big topic this week. So a lot of our learners noticing that gentleness is a very important thing to cultivate when we practice mindfulness. Because if we're trying to hold our attention on the breath, if we're trying to drag it back every time it wanders off, or getting frustrated at ourselves, that's actually just making us more tense. It's going to trigger that stress response in the body. Even you can sit there meditating totally stressed out, can't you, Craig?
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's right. And the harder we try, the more we get in our own way. And so it's been great to see the discussions about noticing more about the mind wandering, noticing more about the self-criticism and this sort of background stuff that's often going on that we don't notice. So that awareness is really a valuable first step into being able to be free of it.
A lot of learners as well, Craig, noticed how self-critical they were, how judgmental and critical the mind can be. And that's a very pervasive habit, isn't it, for a lot of us?
Yeah, that whole sort of self-criticism, and mind you, the level of criticism in the community generally, and it might be one of the things that's driving a lot of mental health problems as well, is the level of criticism that's seen on social media so much of the time these days and so on. But there's a difference between self-appraisal and self-criticism. Self-appraisal is kind of an objective, standing back kind of curiosity and noticing things. The self-criticism tends to be very personal, very harsh, very often not very a balanced perspective on a situation, and it's and that's almost becoming enculturated in some ways. The tendency to really criticize rather than to be constructive, to appraise, to notice, And I think that we're in a sense, if mindfulness is helping us to be more objective and soften that, then that's very useful.
And of course, we can practice mindfulness in every moment. So we can sit and meditate, we can cultivate it throughout the day, just being aware of our mind. And we can also just start to pay attention to everyday activities. And I would say right now, at this time in history, to do things throughout the day with mindfulness is just so important. So whether that's washing the dishes and just feeling the warm water, whether it's eating our breakfast and not having the news on bombarding us with even more negative images and ideas.
Even when some of our learners noted that that the mind was apathetic and not curious about things, and in a funny kind of way, I kind of think we can be curious about a lack of curiosity. Be curious about a tendency of the mind not to notice, not to be interested, for it to be so habituated to be diving off into more internal dialogue and thinking rather than being curious about our own life, our own mind, our own body. What could be more interesting, really?
Curiosity is such an important thing to cultivate, isn't it? So keep doing that for all of our learners. Keep cultivating this sense of curiosity.
Yeah.
And so that's all from us for this week. We'll see you again next week. And over the coming week, we're going to be exploring some really powerful things like the cognitive practices of mindfulness, being aware of certain mental habits that we can use to cultivate mindfulness. We're also going to look at how to focus. And for those of you working at home, really important week. How do we maintain focus to get away from this idea of multitasking, to deal with the distractions of technology so that we can actually get some work done from home? Our mentors will start on Monday the 30th. So please try to stay in sync with the weeks, because that's where that's where the conversation's happening. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye for now.